Hi, this is Old Dominion. Welcome to Thursday at CRS.
By the way, New Faces is a hot ticket, so if you have a ticket and you can't make it, please turn in your tickets.
Hey, after this session, you don't want to miss superstar Eric Church, the keynote speaker. I'll see you there.
Tonight, we gather for an unforgettable celebration of the great Bob Kingsley and his acoustic alley featuring Garth Brooks and Rhett Akins.
Have you heard about the ping pong tournament tonight? Bounce on over there. That's so lame. That's so lame. Seriously, just go to the ping pong tournament. It's at 10 p.m. tonight.
You've heard us talk about the CRS app. Now, that is important. It means you cannot turn off your phone. But you know what? You don't want to be that ignoramus that the phone goes off in the middle of it. And then it's like, really and truly, your ringtone is Scooby-Doo. Mine is. But mine is going to be silenced. Phone on, use the app, ringer off.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the Tech Crystal Ball. If you are here, you are obviously a geek, so we're excited that you're here. You want to learn about kind of where we're going in the industry and the world. This is a unique panel that we have for you today. What has happened over the last 10 years in the radio and broadcast industries is much affected by the technology that we see showing up in the hands and in the cars of the consumers and listeners that we actively try to go after every single day. And as somebody who was born into radio and to records, but left the industry to pursue kind of a world in technology, I'm honored to get to be here. My name is Jeff James. I'm with a company called CX05 Partners out of Houston, Texas. And I'm honored today to have Jim Patterson with us today from Patterson Advisory Group, and Dan Schuff, who is here from a really exciting company called VizSense. And what we're going to talk about today is really kind of a high level of where the industry is going, and then break that down really into what that means for the listener journey of the people that you're trying to go after, and what technologies we're going to see coming into the market. So before I jump into to the entire introduction process here, I want to kind of set the stage. In 2012, I was honored to get to come and speak at CRS about kind of the vision and the future of technology. And I started with a presentation that was a video of starlings in flight. BBC did an amazing video that showcased these birds which fly individually but yet together, with one bird impacting the 5 birds around it, and they fly all together. And the interesting point about that is that not in one recorded video or study of those birds did any of the birds ever collide. And back then the allegory was that is how in the future our listeners and the audiences and our consumers would be migrating from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And so I've brought 2 representatives here today to really talk about that and where it's going in the industry and how that's matured for where radio and records will be moving in the near future. So first I'd like to introduce Dan. Dan, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and kind of your background and about your company?
Great, thanks for having me. My name is Dan Schuff. I spent about 18 years in branding and marketing, mostly on the whiskey side for a publicly traded company. And then I actually hit a pause on my career, went and traveled around the world with my wife, visited 25 countries in almost 10 or 11 months, and came back and consulted for a little bit, and then got into the business development side of emerging technology and what we're doing in the micro-influencer space. So VizSense, it has a unique background on how the foundation of the company started, but really what we do is we're a leading micro-influencer agency, but we take our proprietary technology and we utilize artificial intelligence, machine learning, and a lot of work with data to understand the strength and stickiness of consumer ecosystems to deploy content with what we call surgical precision and economic efficiency. So really locking in on the sticky ecosystems of people, validated by data, so that we can initiate groundswells and brand movements, much like the murmuration that Jeff was talking about a minute ago.
Jim, would you like to tell us a little about your company?
Sure. I'm Jim Patterson. Been in the telecom and wireless industry, internet industry for about 25 years. Before that was a computer programmer, green screen, COBOL and Kix programmer, for those of you who know the computer industry. So been around a while. I currently have an advisory group that focuses on startups and start-ins. So all ears if you have a couple that are interesting. Right now I'm an investor and advisor to a startup that uses drones, big drones, to clean the outsides of buildings. So talk about being a little far away from telecom. That's about as far as you can get. And I do a lot of work, still do a lot of work with the tech industry. Have been an advisor to each of the big four over the past year.
So the image that you're looking at up on the screen before you is an illustration provided to us that is really what the dashboard of a car will look like in the not so distant future. And you'll notice a lot of things on there, but one thing you won't notice is buttons. A lot of touch screen, a lot of sliding, and this goes kind of across the entire dash, if you will, of a vehicle. And one of the things that Jim's companies have done in the past is providing network to those local markets. And so where data is streaming, audio is streaming, we see a lot of data that's coming out of those streams. And to kind of distill it down, what we see is Dan's company taking that kind of data, that interactive data that you see both from mobile devices and dashboards in the future, and kind of distilling it down to how individuals are interacting with each of these different pieces of technology. So Dan, this is a slide that you gave me when we were kind of talking about the panel. Describe what we're kind of seeing in this slide from your perspective.
Yeah, we touched on murmurations of movements a little bit just a minute ago. So this is really just a picture kind of depicting that the voices in the crowd are the loudest ones. And movements, there is no hierarchical structure. So if you think about social movements, music movements, culinary movements, diets, there's no ruler of the throne for the keto diet, right? Like-minded people recruit like-minded individuals to join their movement. And so this is just an example of a crowd, and the person sitting right next to you could be a local, credible voice of authority within a certain ecosystem, and could deliver a message to you in an authentic, organic, and trustworthy way for you to be influenced to make purchasing decisions.
And Jim, in your experience from what you've seen on the network side, how does that impact the shareability of what's going on from the device side?
Yeah, what we've seen and this is from working with, again, each of the large 4, soon to be 3, wireless carriers, is, they are able to harness, they look more at location because they're network companies, but just like Dan has, in the slide, we have, various individuals kind of outlined on the network side, you have various locations outlined, right? So there are areas as networks are getting built out that we know people will go to congregate, and we know that there'll be, what we call them very hot areas.
So how many of you in the audience have heard of the term geofencing, for example? Okay, so really vague term, actually, in the world today of advertising. And what we're really talking about here is taking geofencing down to a very micro level, right? Is that kind of what we're talking about?
Yes.
So we kind of had another slide that we talked about during the beginning, and really kind of how does that translate into better insights for both listeners and influencers? Dan, would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the antiquated approach or the traditional approach was really a top-down methodology. So you saw things come from the white ivory tower, and it was pushed down. The data that we see is 91% of the marketers think their content is relevant and engaging, although 51% of the consumers think that content's relevant and engaging. So we like to identify people to curate that content so it's relevant in bridging that gap of that 41% disparity between what brand marketers think is relevant and what the audience and the consumer thinks is relevant. And so on an example that you have today, that's 10 nodes and 45 connections. So connections are the key, right? Consumers are looking for key consumer connections. And with this example right here is it's less on the top-down approach with having 10 nodes and 3 touch points, and more on having 10 nodes and 45 touch points with the audience.
So really kind of at a larger level, I'm hearing extrapolation of where the large companies used to think of themselves as the content managers. Now everybody's a content manager downstream.
I think the other way to kind of think about this, Jeff, is as we kind of start to think more about information and the information that's carried locally, is to really think hard about in the data world, in Dan's world, he thinks a lot about anonymizing data, right? Because no one cares to know that I ate fish last night. They care to know that somebody in Mooresville, North Carolina ate fish, or they may care to know that somebody in my section, where I live in Mooresville, North Carolina, ate fish. But they, before it had been much more centralized. Mm-hmm. And what you're seeing now with data is a lot more of that data driven by applications, right, is being driven much more. The need for data is being driven. It's still anonymous. It's still private, but you're getting more details about, who watched Disney Plus on my street last night, and potentially what they watched, as long as you get enough to create a good sample size, that's okay. But it's now, instead of it becoming, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500 data points in a given evening, it's now becoming, let's say, 250 or 300 in a given evening to help determine data needs.
So I'd like to take a moment. You remember in your app, you can certainly ask questions as we kind of go through this. And if you'd like to submit a question, we'll be happy to answer it as we go through. One of the things that you said when we were kind of preparing, Jim, about kind of how the brands are stacking up in terms of added value. Yeah. And I think you kind of gave us some idea. You want to talk a little bit about?
So one of the things I kind of do on the side, and it really isn't kind of is I've for about 7 years I've been tracking the creation of value across both the telecom and tech industries. And so if any of you don't have anything to do on Sunday mornings, and please don't read while you're in church. I was told this is not creating a good habit for people. But I write a brief called the Sunday Brief, usually comes out around noon. And we hit about 10,000 people in the telecom industry, so it's a pretty big deal, and it gets republished in a magazine or publication called RCR Wireless, where I'm on the editorial board. So but we spend a lot of time thinking about value creation, because at the end of the day, you can have the best plans, you can have the best processes, but if you don't create demand and create profits, nobody's going to want to invest in your company, right? So we look a lot at that, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about the telecom industry, and the telecom industry had a blockbuster year last year. The top five, so AT&T, T-Mobile, Comcast, Charter, and Verizon, in total created $220 billion of increased stock value last year, market value, and that was I don't know if that was a record, but it was darn close to a record for a single year. And even at that, they missed the overall averages in the market. But still, that's very, very good for the industry. The industry struggled as in various forms to be able to carry on with that. But what you have to do is kind of understand that in context, right? Those are all big companies. AT&T's huge, Verizon. They're all big companies. But you have to take that in context, and context is compared to the top five tech companies, so Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Alphabet, whatever you want to call them, Facebook, they created over $1.6 trillion in increased equity market value last year. So while we feel so good about that, in the telecom industry, they're kind of high-fiving, but yet they just got lapped, 5x or 6x by the industry.
And I think one of the key takeaways of that point that Jim is making is that, if you look at listener top five or $12 billion in total revenues, our job is to take back and create more shareholder value. But what we're really being given, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, when you're kind of looking at it, the telcos are giving us more access to more consumers with more bandwidth to then, which gleans us more data to then use. So it's not a negative, it's a positive. in that regard. Would you agree with that and kind of where your guys are going?
Yeah, I think, it's what we touched upon earlier as it relates to an analogy that we like to use with data. I mean, you almost get tired of hearing about tech and data because everyone's talking about it and you're inundated with it, ad nauseum. But the reality is, and, I was telling Jim and Jeff this today, is we like to use the analogy of a Michelin star chef. So if you put the three of us up here in a room next to a Michelin star chef, everybody has the same ingredients. Everybody has the same data. But it's what you do with those ingredients and the blender that you put that in and the output and the insights that you can glean from that in order to make actionable results. So as it relates here with the gig economy and what tech and data have done, this is really more around localization. I talked a little bit about movements and murmurations, but it starts at a local level. I mean, the bottom-up approach starts with the power of one, with the trusted individual in an authentic way. And right here, when when Airbnb was growing globally, they went from 3 mattresses in the founder's house or residence to having a 2011 global plan. And what they did was they said, we need to take a foreign product and we need to localize it. So what did they do? In Paris, they hired local artisans and chefs and strong voices in the communities to talk about how great it was to stay in that area and not at a 3, 4, 5-star hotel. And they had insurmountable amount of success, and they launched that philosophy globally in Berlin and everywhere else around the world, all around the localization of the content through the application of data and technology. So, things are changing fast. I tell some people are turning themselves into a retailer. Yeah. And they're like, what do you mean by that? Well, Poshmark, there's somebody I work with that has 85,000 followers or friends on Poshmark, and if she puts a new pair of shoes on there, someone's going to buy it for $100. Yep. And, it could be called a side hustle or whatever you want to call it, but it's a gig economy with Uber. If you have a telephone, an automobile, and car keys, you have a job. And in today's environment, your boss could be an app. Like, that's pretty wild.
Right.
Yeah.
What's interesting as Dan was saying about this is that the data, whether it's coming from a wireless carrier or it's data you're collecting from the app or it's other data that you're discovering, that data may not always tell the same story. It's important, as I like the example of the Michelin chef, it's important to be able to, and that's where I think each of you guys kind of come in, is you guys understand the markets, right? You can build it as in data science, right? We try to build an expected result. You guys can build that expected result pretty easily, and bounce that up against, what the data is trying to tell you. What as you guys understand, as you've all been around, and we've had data for a long time to kind of look at, but some data is very hard to understand.
That's right.
Is that a nice way of saying it?
It's a nice way to say it.
Sometimes it's crap, right? I mean, there's a lot of noise you got to sort through, and sometimes, myself included, we get caught up in the routine of collecting data and saying, "Oh, it looks just about the same as it used to look. Therefore, it's okay. It's good data." And we miss the whatever's coming down the pike, right? Or we miss a pocket of underutilization, which is what the data is not telling us, as opposed to what the data is telling us. Go ahead.
And we've got a question from the audience. I want to take that a second. But by show of hands, how many of you guys have a data discipline inside your organizations today where so you guys are actively looking at the data on a routine basis for your advertisers or for your partners? That's great. And that'll be the next big step or evolution, really, for what we see in the country music industry, using this hyper-local information to make even better choices and selections. Judy, you got a question?
Right. I have a couple questions from the audience. One, what is the role of media in artist curation and discovery as consumers are giving a stronger voice? And how can we empower our community while also serving as the prominent voice, or at least one of them?
Let me reframe that, if I may, for my gentleman up here. So if we how will we take information, right, to empower the listeners? And Dan, you and I kind of talked about this a little bit, knowing the difference between, instead of at a DMA level, maybe even at a even a closer level at the edge. Maybe give the example we talked about with Sugarland versus the Galleria, how you would know data or customers differently based on their user habits in those local areas.
Yeah, it's just around more of the movement of the people. I think as it relates to that question is really trusting the voice of the crowd and putting the music in the hearts and the minds of the super fans and letting that create the momentum and the traction versus the top-down approach of selecting music that New York or Chicago tells you that you have to play.
Right. And there's a piece to it as well. I'd just like to add that I've heard some conversation around, which is what we're seeing in the marketplace now is finding those one or two individuals that are leading it and then hyper-focusing on them. Not that they self-identified, but that we've identified them through the data. There's a big difference between self-identifying, hey, I'm a huge fan of Thomas Rhett, versus actually what I shared, liked, and pushed out to my 400 or 500 people. And you're only going to see that in the metadata. You're not necessarily going to see that in my Facebook feed. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, not looking at vanity analytics. I mean, one of the pieces around the technology or the enablement of technology is to understand where there's a high level of fraudulent activity and or identifying people that aren't credible voices. So we don't, like follower count, and I'll show you this in a few slides, means absolutely zero to us.
Right.
The vanity metrics that you look at on the surface can be very misleading as it relates to finding that credible voice in order to get something to trigger and to snowball and to create that movement or that murmuration. So this is an example right here. I like to use the analogy of the zoo versus a jungle when I talk about some of the data piece. And brand marketers, they'll usually do a focus group around 30 to 40 people. I used to say 300 to 400 because I was a part of some focus groups that did that, and somebody from a Fortune 40 company laughed, and I said, well, why are you laughing at that? And she said, we used 30 to 40. So think about innovation, product, packaging, brand marketing, strategy, consumer voice and message. All that gets scrutinized by focus groups. And of all the millions of people that live in the United States and around the world, they talk to 30 or 40 people. And it's the analogy that I like to use, which is a zoo. It's a very controlled environment. You're feeding certain animals at certain times. The jungle is going underneath the canopy and looking at the ecosystems. Where are the primates and the amphibians and the water sources, and where the trees grow higher, or where's there moss and on the rock beds or whatever. So with this particular example, we took a brand. Again, they do focus groups of 30 to 40 people to go find who the consumer is that they need to talk to. And we looked at over 650,000 pieces of data to perform a 30-day campaign on 3 narratives, which are 4 narratives that really got down to taste, price, ingredients, and authenticity. But it was the use of artificial intelligence and social scraping to go get 650,000 pieces of data, plug that into IBM Watson, identify key nodes or nodules of what those high levels of propensity words were, and curate narratives that allow us to do really one thing: initiate conversations in a more relevant, authentic way to help get traction from the audience.
I think the other piece, to answer the question that was there, I think the other piece is to identify those areas where, due to technological changes that we've left behind, but there still is a need in the community. I'll give you an example. I live in race car central, Mooresville, North Carolina, everything's race this, race that, and there's a lot of NASCAR, and I like NASCAR. I've had to warm up to it, but I like it. It's a pretty good thing, and but there's also this top 10 liberal arts college that sits down the road called Davidson College. Happen to be a graduate of it. I should be more involved in it, but not. But I've got these two conflicting, kind of entities that exist right there.
Right.
No idea what's going on at either place. None. Not unless I want to go to Facebook, log in. In other words, I have to initiate that activity. I think there's some value. There's some outreach value in whatever form of communication. And again, I think I would be considered a suburb of Charlotte because we're about 20 miles from Charlotte. It's still kind of its own little town, but I think identifying those gaps that exist and then matching those up. I happen to be a founding member of a company of an organization called Launch LKN, which is LKN stands for Lake Norman, which is where I live, and we try to reach out to people in the community, and we find all these people who have moved to Charlotte from other locations, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, whatever, and they live on the lake in these nice homes, and they don't do anything. And just getting one guy involved, I can tell you, he was former vice president of marketing for Harley Davidson. He's a great guy. Just getting him involved changed, 3 or 4 different business plans in the area. And, but it's finding those ways to, he wouldn't have known about it had a friend not said, hey, you really need to go to this. You need to be a mentor.
Right.
Right. And I think we need to look for those gaps that are being created by what I call the technological changes that are occurring, and then find out how we replace that with something that's also takes advantage of the same technology.
Yeah, and I think it's the stack of both understanding the data, the consumer, the listener, and then also being able to add that creative quality that local radio has always done and added to that. Judy, we got another question?
Yeah, I have a great question for Dan. Dan, how do you influence the micro-influencers programmatically? If so, how can radio implement over terrestrial and streaming? Or is it restricted to programmatic display, programmatic video, etc.?
And use if you will, talk about the apparel example. I think that's a great example to that question.
As it relates to programmatic, I think, look, you have to have a holistic strategy, and there's certain levers within each piece of the marketing mix that you need to do to drive a level of 2 things, consideration and conversion. And specific to programmatic or other sorts of touch points, we're always looking at A/B testing, what worked, what didn't, and why. What's the data tell you? Sometimes I talk to people and they're like, well, the CEO wants to do this. And I'm like, well, why? Like, what were the results? Consumer recruit, well, the CEO wanted to do it and it felt good. Well, in marketing, I think the days of like things feeling good are quickly coming to an end. I was giving Jeff an example, which is on part of the screen right here, as it relates to micro and even nano. We talked about localization and, I kind of chuckled. I'm like, it's actually getting down to kind of the nano level right now. But I found this guy, I was, working with someone and we were tracking some sports apparel and some conversations around that. And so our technology takes conversations in social platforms and understand who's sharing anything from a press release to a URL to a social media piece of content. And this particular brand was looking to recruit consumers into their brand via like the non-enthusiasts of the non-cores. And so I started tracking things on like just some random places. If I gave too many specifics, I'd give it away, and I don't want to. But anyway, found this guy, Chris. He's got 747 followers. He's got, how many? 1,600 are following him. He did this tweet that I was following. 10 people retweeted it, and he reached 12.7 million people. Like, that's amazing. So tying this all together, when we talk about murmurations and movements and voices in the crowd, like, there's a guy with 747 people in his network that reached 12.7 million. And what you do is when you take 10, 15, 12, 8, or whatever of those in your market or your region, or the total U.S., or we did a 15-person campaign globally and got everybody spun up. But you stitch all that content together, right, within those micro and those nano ecosystems to not reach the 12.7, but to reach hundreds of millions if possible.
Right. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Judy, you have another one?
Yeah, another great question. How will the creation of new digital streaming platforms that are commercial-free affect terrestrial radio going forward? Do terrestrial stations need to invest more in digital formats for their listeners?
Jim, this is right up your alley.
I was going to say,
And would you give your background with Pandora?
Yeah. So in my Sprint role, I ran what was called the Carrier Markets Group, and the Carrier Markets Group carried all of our large users. Sprint was one of the original backbones, fiber backbones that formed the internet. One of the AS, what's called AS, early AS numbers that formed the internet. So we owned in the early days of the internet. There were 2 hubs, believe it or not, just 2. There was one in San Jose, and there was one in Pennsauken, New Jersey. And we ran the one in Pennsauken. And so that gave us a different calling card when we went to call on companies like eBay and this fledgling company called Pandora at the time. And I had to go visit their CEO because if we couldn't come to terms, they were gonna owe us a lot of money, and they didn't have any. So we ended up striking a deal with them. But the early days of the music streaming business, were kind of rough. And I think to answer the question, I think it's a mix of both, right? I think and it's not driven necessarily by the value orientation of the consumer. I think it's driven more by, the thought that I either do ad-free or I do ad-supported, and that's all I do. It's like a toggle, like a switch. I don't think that's true in a family. At least I can tell you it's not true in the research that I've put together and the research we've done for other companies on this, and that applies as well to streaming video, right? There's a lot of characteristics that are similar in terms of user habits. So I think it's a mix of both. I think what's most important in this is being able to determine the overall aggregate profile of that family, whether that's a household or an individual, whatever that is, and be able to use that aggregate profile in order to make good programming decisions.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing to that, which is, the way that the networks are building, the speed at which they're building down to the local level. I mean, I'm talking, down the street from where you're at, and putting 5G up on the buildings is allowing for more streaming to take place. But in the consumer's mind, they're still seeing it as radio. They're not kind of putting it in a box anymore. It was in a box a while back, but now it's actually decoupling itself because they're seeing it however they get it. Now the FM receiver, quote unquote, is now coming through a broadband because the quality is better. Why would I tune into AM and get it crappily downtown when I can listen to that AM station vis-a-vis the broadband stream on my phone? So the technology is finally catching up with what was the optimal user experience.
The other thing to keep your eye on in this, and it's new, it's kind of in the early adoption part of this, and that is, as you guys know, we're going to be bombarded, if we're not already bombarded, with different video streaming options that'll happen. And as you guys know, we have a number of, shall we just call them portals, to use the old internet term, that have been set up. Roku, right? You can get, I think it's 5,900 channels now on Roku you can choose from. But what's interesting is in certain categories there's a dearth, a real shortage of others. And one of the areas that at least has been mentioned to me for Charlotte and Spartanburg Greenville area in South Carolina is local. Right. So there's no, WBTV or, no local Roku channel right now. They're putting one together quickly, but that's probably the next piece, right? And it takes both, right? An audio could be an audio format, could be a video format, could be both.
Right. You had a question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Doug Kirk from Toronto, Canada, and I was just wondering your perspective. Obviously, we're in the radio business, and we've invested a lot of money, and we're buying, dozens of terabits when we used to buy megabits for streaming and so on. The other thing we have a question about, and it's had a longer life in the U.S. than Canada, and that's HD radio.
Yeah.
So in terms of delivery systems going forward, I mean, we're one of the few in Canada that have implemented HD on a couple of our stations, and it's not going very fast. And I sort of feel it's sort of flatlined here. And I just wondered if that technology has any legs going forward, or if we're all going to be into higher quality and more terabits to reach the digital side.
So Dan, Jim, I'll let you answer that, but I want to add a caveat to what I know Jim is about to say, which is the reason, one of the reasons that the networks have not just spent but made, and the valuation slide you look back at, is because they recognize that through vis-a-vis that transport style, HD, right, they're not getting the feedback data, the metadata, right, off of the device on the other end. And so, Jim, talk a little bit about this build out to the nodes and why that would compete necessarily.
Yeah. So what you're seeing now, this is an interesting trend, and again, if you follow the telecom industry, the new hot term for this year is called M as in multi, E as in edge, C as in computing, MEC, and everybody will just talk about MEC. What it is if you think about what's happened, is we took a lot of information and we centralized it because it was more efficient. But now we need to use it more quickly, so we got to push some of that information back down to where we can make faster decisions, right? I mean, that's why the edge is existing. As I say, we need the edge so we don't crash the autonomous vehicle, because you can't make decisions fast enough from 3 locations around the globe, right? So you have to. And that applies whether it's autonomous vehicles or you're trying to diagnose a patient in a local hospital, or you're trying to determine whether fraud is occurring on your credit card. There are transactions that have to be done and be done quickly. Right. And to answer your question, I think there are 2 things going on. So if you sat in the boardrooms of the large telcos, here's what happens. There's this chart, and we all can think about what this chart looks like because we all live it every day on our own world. Is we used to use something called hundreds of megabytes a month. Now we use gigabytes a month. Now we don't care. In the U.S., we don't care because we get up to 20 some odd gigabytes or 50, depending on who your provider is. But we just use. We use and we pay, right? And it's basically come back down to revenue per connection, not so much revenue per megabyte or whatever. So as long as that still continues, and it will, as we continue to build faster networks, and as we build networks closer and where decisions are ultimately made closer and closer to the customer, then you get to a very interesting dynamic, which is a very, very interesting dynamic that's going to start to occur shortly, and that is as you continue to work through digital rights and digital rights management, and you're starting to see it now in the music side, and that is the carriers are actually pushing premium voice services. If you guys, I think it's AT&T offers you to Spotify Premium. I think you'll start to see some interesting things go on with what they're going to do with HBO Max. And basically what they're going to do is they're going to use some of that unused capacity in your phone, maybe a gigabyte or 2 or 3 or 4 in your phone, and they're going to remember it, right? They're going to know that you like to watch a certain show, and they'll make sure the first 5 minutes are loaded. And that's just to take the tax off the network. That's all it is. So long story short, and the easy answer to your question is, the carriers have an intuitive need to push it through their network, less to use what's called unlicensed spectrum or even free spectrum, and more of an incentive to do that, not only to get the underlying metadata, as Jeff was mentioning before, but also to be able to use a more efficient storage and because they're the underlying provider of the service.
Yeah. So in kind of the last minutes here, I kind of put a bow on the conversation here today. Two real things stick out as we kind of started putting this panel together, and I wanted to kind of leave you with this thought today. We're seeing, not just the networks building further to the edge, but we're also seeing more data through Dan's companies like Dan's company that are finding new opportunities for us to research and understand the consumer at the binary level. And I think what's important to look at as you think about the next 3 to 5 years of your business, it really is partnering with someone who's got a data discipline or building that data discipline internally to help your customers. Additionally, recommending, and we've recommended these strategies for some of our clients, which is go find companies who are using data like this. Pick up the phone and call guys like Dan or Jim and say, hey, who are the brands? Because the brands that are using this type of data are spending money. And if your product, your listener base, your market matches up with what they're finding in this metadata, their purchasing decision is a whole lot quicker. Because they understand where to spend the money, obviously, to maximize their budgets and their values. Thank you for attending. Thank you for being here. Please make sure you rate our panel. That's how I keep my job. And these guys get a bonus of some kind. I'm not even sure what that is. But thank you, Dan, and thank you, Jim, for your time today.